Hello everyone and welcome back to the program. When the people of ancient Israel demanded a human king to rule over them like other nations around them, God gave them Saul, a man of the people. Saul was wealthy, nice looking, and powerfully built. And early on, he was also a man after God's own heart, a humble servant of God who acted with godly courage and fear. On today's program, we'll examine the early life of a righteous King Saul.
The Trumpet Daily.
Saul's righteous rule was cut short later in life because of rebellion and disobedience. Many are familiar with those very sad and tragic events. It really is a sobering lesson for us today. In the former prophet's book, my father's book, he says that we should understand why Saul failed, even though he had such a great opportunity. What an opportunity he had, and he got off to such a great start as well. My father recounts some of this history in this wonderful book, The Former Prophets. There's so many valuable lessons, and it's so practical, the instruction in here. The Former Prophets, how to become a king, how to be a leader. You can look at great examples like King David and see some qualities there that we want to follow or emulate. And you can also look at some failures and learn from those mistakes. But in the case of King Saul, if you go to the early part of his life, you become familiar with a man who was very dedicated to God's work, who was a man of upstanding character, a man of tremendous courage and faith, and a man who was little in his own eyes. He was humble before God. Let's notice some of that history. We'll start our study today in 1 Samuel chapter 9, and we'll pick it up in verse 1. Read your Bible along with me and see these lessons for yourself. As I say, it's a sobering warning in one sense, and it's also very encouraging when you look at how God used this man when his heart was right. 1 Samuel 9 here in verse 1, it says, "Now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish." It says then at the end of the verse, "a mighty man of power." This is Saul's dad, his father. He was a valiant warrior. And so Saul came from a strong family where the father headed up that household, and he was a man of power. He was a man of upstanding character. He was a man of influence, a strong and disciplined man. And so right away we see some of the advantages and opportunities that Saul had because of this upbringing. Verse 2 continues. It says, "And he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man, and a goodly," it says. "And there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people." So he comes from this wealthy and influential family. And then, of course, on the outside, he's an impressive-looking individual as well. Nice-looking, strong, powerful, very tall. And yet on the inside, he was right before God as well. This was the people, if you know the history leading up to this, the people demanded that God give them a king like the nations around them. And Samuel the prophet was angered by that. But God said, go ahead and give them a king. And this is the one that God chose. On the outside, that's exactly what the people wanted, someone that was impressive looking. But what a merciful God to also give them a man who had a heart like God's. Early on, he was humble and obedient, as I say. Well, you can read in the next few verses where his father lost some mules, and so he sends Saul out to find them. And really, God was orchestrating this whole episode so that Saul could meet up with the prophet Samuel. God was behind these events. Let's skip down to verse 15. It says, "Now the Eternal had told Samuel," this is the prophet now, "in his ear, a day before Saul came, saying, 'Tomorrow, about this time, I will send you a man out of the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be captain over my people,' God says, 'my people Israel, that he may save my people out of the hand of the Philistines. For I have looked upon my people, because their cry is come unto me. And so God worked all of this out, as I said. And notice what he says there about this young leader, Saul. He's going to be over my people, and I'm going to use him to save my people. He's going to be the leader that the people look to. He selected a man, God did, as I said, whose attitude was really humble and submissive early on. Continuing in the story here, it says in verse 20, and on whom is all the desire of Israel. This is Samuel talking to Saul. On whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you, Samuel says to Saul, and on all your father's house? All the desire of Israel, it's on you. It's on your household. It's on your shoulders. And notice how Saul responded. Saul answered and said, Am not I a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Wherefore then speak you so to me? Now, as we've noted, Saul was actually from a wealthy and influential family, but he didn't see himself that way. He didn't view his family that way. He said, Who am I? I'm a nobody. That you would bestow this kind of honor on me? How can this be? In Saul's eyes, God was so much bigger than he was. The nation of Israel was so much bigger than he was. So he was in awe of this opportunity, this responsibility. And he was, as I say, he was very small in his own eyes. He didn't view himself as some big deal. He didn't view himself as this great, talented individual. He knew that if he was going to lead the people of Israel, that he needed God's guidance. He needed God's guiding hand. He needed the mighty power of God, God's Holy Spirit. Let's pick it up in chapter 10. This is 1 Samuel 10, and verse 1. It says, Then Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it upon his head and kissed him and said, Is it not because the Eternal has anointed you to be the captain over his inheritance? You're anointed to be the captain, to be the leader. And in the next few verses, Samuel gives him 3 signs that would prove that God would back him, that God would be with him. And the third of those signs involved Saul meeting up with this company of prophets, these young students, out prophesying with their musical instruments. Notice verse 5. It says, After that you shall come to the hill of God, where is the garrison of the Philistines, and it shall come to pass, when you are come there to the city, that you shall meet a company of prophets coming down from the high place with a psaltery and a tabret and a pipe and a harp before them, and they shall prophesy. So here comes this company of prophets, or students coming out from the schools of Samuel. Samuel had raised up 3 colleges. And so here were some balanced individuals who were really into music and prophesying and obeying God's laws. They were living a balanced lifestyle, as God's disciples or students do. Verse 6, it says, And the Spirit of the Eternal will come upon you. This is Samuel speaking to Saul. The Spirit of God will come upon you, and you shall prophesy with them, and shall be turned into another man. The prophet of God is telling Saul here, this young king, that the Spirit of God would come upon him and turn him into another man. In the New Testament, it often says a new man. Conversion is a process of burying the old man, as the Apostle Paul wrote, and then coming up out of that watery grave at baptism, a new man. And that's essentially what the prophet was telling Saul here, that when the Spirit of God comes into your mind, you're going to be converted into a son of God. The process of conversion, this is what it involves, converting to a God being. Matthew 5:48 says, Become you therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And so here we see these dramatic changes happening in the life of Saul. We see him turning into another man because of the Spirit of God, because of the character of God in him. What an attitude. I mean, in Saul, God had a lot to work with. He sure did. Verse 9 continues, and it was so that when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, God gave him another heart, and all those signs came to pass that day. Those signs that the prophet gave to him, they came to pass. And it says here, when he left away from Samuel, that God gave him another heart. It came from God. This was God's attitude. This was God's nature. This was the divine nature, as the Apostle Peter wrote about in the New Testament. God gave him this humble, submissive attitude. Of course, Saul did his part. He yielded to God's lead. He yielded to God's authority. He was submissive to God his Father and to Samuel the prophet. And what a change. What a change this brought in his life. Verse 10 says, and when they came there to the hill, behold, a company of prophets met him, and the Spirit of God came upon him, and he prophesied among them. He was there prophesying with these students, these disciples, these prophets, singing, preaching, speaking for God, leading. This is the kind of leader that God chooses. Verse 11, it says, and it came to pass, when all that knew him before time saw that, behold, he prophesied among the prophets, then the people said one to another, what is this that is come unto the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? I mean, he had grown so much in a short period of time that his friends from a while back could hardly recognize him. Is this the same young man? Look at the change. Look at the dramatic change in his character, in his service to God. There are a lot of advantages here. God really did bless him with a strong upbringing. He grew up, Saul did, in a wonderful family with a loving father, a strong, valiant man. He also was a man, Saul was, of humility. When Samuel came to anoint him, he said, who am I? Who am I to have this honor bestowed on me? Later on in the story, when he was officially presented before the Israelites as king, they had to run and find him. The scripture says he was hiding in the stuff. He was hiding. So he was humbled by this calling. He didn't just jump, in front of a camera, so to speak, to try to get all of the attention on himself. Not the young Saul. Now, as I say, that would change later in life. Not much later, sadly. But early on, what a heart. Submissive to God, looking to God's prophet, looking to the government of God, obedient to the commandments of God. This is what the early record brings out. He was led by the Spirit, as we just read. The Spirit came upon him. And we don't receive the Spirit of God, as it says in the New Testament, Acts 5:32, unless we're obedient or unless we're led by it. That's Romans 8 and verse 14. And so he was obviously being led by the Spirit. He was following as a submissive child of God. And God was using him. And then, of course, he also was a man of great courage, and we'll see that coming up in the next segment. A man who acted in faith, who trusted God for deliverance. This is the story of a young King Saul. Look down at verse 24. It says here, and Samuel said to all the people, see you him whom the Lord has chosen, that there is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted and said, God save the king. I mean, they were happy with this kind of a leader that God chose, it says. God chose this man. God chose him to be king. What a merciful and loving God, as I said earlier. I mean, for God, even though he was upset by Israel choosing a human king instead of God their king, still God gave them this righteous human leader. And he said, now you look to this man. So many of these lessons, as I say, they're brought out in this wonderful book, The Former Prophets, how to be a king, how to lead, how to be a true Christian. Make sure if you haven't requested this book, it's I think well over 200 pages. We offer it to you free of charge, without cost, without follow-up. Just write down the information you see on your screen and call our operators during the break, and we'll send you out a free copy of the Former Prophets. We'll be right back.
Many regard the former prophets as mere history, saying that these books have little value for us today. But these books are mostly prophetic and contain spiritual history that is primarily intended for us in this end time. Many authorities agree that history is our most effective teacher, and your Bible has the most important history of all. In fact, the Bible explains that Israel's history was recorded for our instruction and admonition in this very age. It is critical that you learn from these spiritual warriors of the past. Warriors such as Joshua, Samuel, and David, who has the greatest and longest biography in the Bible. You need to learn about Elijah and Elisha and understand why Saul failed, even though God gave him such a great opportunity. These books will teach you how to be a leader, how to build faith, and give you invaluable instruction that is directly applicable to your life today. If you would like to study these great spiritual warriors, you can request our free book, The Former Prophets. All of our literature is offered free of charge, without cost or obligation.
We'll move ahead in our study now to 1 Samuel chapter 11. Notice, starting in verse 1, it says here, "Then Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, 'Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you.' And these are the Israelites, cowering in fear. Here comes this Ammonite. It says in verse 2, 'And Nahash the Ammonite answered them, On this condition will I make a covenant with you, that I may thrust out all your right eyes and lay it for a reproach upon all Israel.'" So, pretty lopsided negotiation here. Israel's cowering in fear, and then this Ammonite king comes up and says, "Sure, you can be subservient to me, and I'm going to gouge out your eyes just to make sure that you don't rise up against me." What a time in Israel. And for Saul and his reign, I mean, this was his first real test. And let's see how he reacted. Let's see what he did. This is the young Saul standing up for God. Notice verse 5. It says here, "And behold, Saul came after the herd of the field. And Saul said, 'What ails the people that they weep? What's going on here? What's happened?' And they told him the tidings of the men of Jabesh. And the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard those tidings, and his anger was kindled greatly." He was indignant. This was righteous indignation, because as we just read, the Spirit of God came upon him. I mean, this is the way Saul thought and acted and behaved as a young ruler for God. He loved what God loved, and he hated what God hated. And if God was upset and angry about something, then so was Saul. He was righteously indignant. God's Spirit stirred him up. And just to follow on what I said in the first segment, that's the way God's Spirit will work in our lives as well, so long as we don't quench it, so long as we're using it, so long as we're being led by the Spirit. Verse 7 continues, "And he took a yoke of oxen and hewed them in pieces." Well, basically he cuts up this ox and sends the pieces throughout Israel and says, "If you don't get behind me and fight for God, this is what's going to happen to your flock. This is what's going to happen to your livelihood." And so the people, they reacted. They showed up in support of Saul. I mean, here was a man acting in righteous fear of God, acting with courage and faith, quickly mobilizing the Israelite army to stand up to this menace, this tyrant. Verse 11, "And it was so on the morrow that Saul put the people in 3 companies And they came into the midst of the host in the morning watch, and slew the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it came to pass that they which remained were scattered, so that 2 of them were not left together. So it was just a complete and total rout. The mighty Israelite army, under the leadership and the direction of King Saul, a man of faith at this point, leading by faith, trusting in God for deliverance. And notice that, verse 12, and the people said to Samuel, who is he that said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring them in, that we may put them to death. I mean, now the people are really getting behind this king, as they could see this is a man of faith, and anyone who disagrees with him should be put to death. Verse 13, and Saul said, there shall not be a man put to death this day, for today the Lord has wrought salvation in Israel. See, the people wanted to give Saul all of the credit, and Saul wanted to give God the credit. Saul gave God the credit, for today the Lord has wrought salvation in Israel. God did this. God gave us the victory. God's the one that led the charge. This is the kind of attitude the young Saul had, courage and faith. Now, as you move into chapter 12, you have the prophet Samuel re-enter the scene as he reminds the Israelites of their history and the course that they've chosen to follow after a human king. This was not what God wanted, but it's what the people chose. And even still, God in His mercy, through His prophet Samuel, says to the people and to the king, King Saul, now if you obey my voice, if you obey my commandments, then you'll be blessed. You'll be a strong nation. But if you disobey, curses will set in. This is what God had said to Israel from the very beginning. Chapter 12 and verse 6, it says, and Samuel said unto the people, it is the Lord that advanced Moses and Aaron. As I say, he's reminding them of their history, and that brought your fathers up out of the land of Egypt. Now therefore stand still, that I may reason with you before the Eternal of all the righteous acts of the Lord, which He did to you and to your fathers. Stand still while I give you this history, this glorious history, and learn from it. Just like these many lessons in the former prophet's book. Learn these lessons. Learn how to lead. Learn how to follow God. Verse 13 says, now therefore, behold, the king whom you have chosen and whom you have desired, and behold, the Lord has set a king over you. So they wanted the king. They were desperate for their own king. And so God set one over them. God, as I've noted here, God selected this man, down in verse 14. If you will fear the Eternal and serve Him and obey His voice and not rebel against the commandment of God, then shall both you and also the king that reigns over you continue following the Lord your God. But if you will not obey the voice of the Eternal, but rebel against the commandment of God, then shall the hand of the Eternal be against you, as it was against your fathers. You see, cause and effect, blessings and cursings. This is what it always gets back to. And the chapter concludes with this: only fear the Eternal and serve Him in truth with all your heart, for consider how great things He has done for you. But if you shall still do wickedly, you shall be consumed, both you and your king. It was a warning for the people, a prophecy and a warning for both the Israelites and the king. And in the case of that king, King Saul, what a great opportunity he had in front of him. And what a great start. What a great start. If only he would have stayed the course. If only he would have continued in the way that he started. I mean, starting out, he was totally committed to God. He was little in his own eyes. He was humble. He was submissive. But then later on, his vanity and self-righteousness, it got the best of him. He became hasty, making snap judgments. He was impatient. He wouldn't wait on God. He wouldn't trust God in faith. And then when these mistakes were pointed out to him by the prophet Samuel, he started to justify his actions. He started to blame the people. He started to blame the prophet. What a change. What happened? What happened to this young king who got off to such an amazing start? Well, I don't have time to to get into the downfall. But let's just go over to one lesson here that Samuel pointed out when Samuel the prophet was correcting him. This is 1 Samuel 15 and verse 22. It says here, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Eternal?" The prophet says, "Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams." See, to obey is better than sacrifice. Saul started to trust in himself. He started to rely on himself instead of God. He was still busy. He was still making sacrifices. That's the point of this correction. He was still a man of action, but he wasn't submitted to God like he was previously. He was out making sacrifices, but it was all by his human effort. It wasn't God in him. It wasn't the Spirit moving him like in those previous instances. And what a difference. To obey, the prophet says to him, to obey is better than to sacrifice. This is one of so many valuable lessons brought out in this story, covered along with quite a few other stories, histories, biographies in this wonderful book, The Former Prophets. So many practical lessons, steps that you can take to follow God's lead, to submit to God's authority, to be led by the Spirit. Make sure you request The Former Prophets, and also, if you haven't subscribed yet, to our monthly magazine, the Trumpet magazine, which will help for you to understand world news under the clear light of Bible prophecy. Make sure, if you haven't subscribed yet, that you subscribe today. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.